Have you ever judged someone so quickly, so harshly, that the memory of it keeps you awake at night years later? Have you ever dismissed another human being based on nothing but their appearance, only to discover that you were catastrophically wrong? Well, let me tell you about the dirty child I turned away from my restaurant on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and the balance he left behind that haunts me to this very day. This isn't just a story about a mistake. This is a confession about the moment that shattered everything I thought I knew about compassion, humanity, and the invisible threads that connect us all. My name doesn't matter anymore, but what I did, what I failed to see, that matters more than anything I've ever experienced in my 43 years on this planet. I owned a small upscale bistro in downtown Seattle, a place where wealthy tech entrepreneurs and business executives would gather for lunch meetings and power dinners. We had white tablecloths, crystal wine glasses, and a reputation for exclusivity that I had worked 15 years to build. I was proud of that reputation. I was proud of the clientele we attracted, the Michelin star we'd been chasing, the reviews that called us sophisticated and refined. But pride, I've learned, can be the most dangerous thing we carry in our hearts. It was October 14th, and the rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of relentless Seattle downpour that soaks through everything and chills you to the bone. I was standing near the front entrance, reviewing the reservation list for the evening service when I saw him through the glass door. A child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, absolutely filthy from head to toe. His clothes were torn and mud-stained, his hair matted and wet, his face streaked with dirt. He was holding something in his hands, some kind of envelope or folder, clutching it against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. And he was staring at me through the glass with eyes that I can still see when I close my own. They were dark brown, those eyes, filled with something I didn't recognize at the time because I wasn't really looking. I wasn't seeing him as a person. I was seeing him as a problem, a disruption to the carefully curated atmosphere I had spent years creating. My first instinct wasn't compassion. It wasn't curiosity about why a child would be out alone in this weather, soaking wet and clearly in distress. No, my first instinct was annoyance. I was annoyed that this dirty street kid was standing at my door, potentially scaring away the well-dressed customers who were my bread and butter. I was annoyed that I would have to deal with this situation, that I would have to be the one to send him away. And God forgive me, I was annoyed by the very sight of him, by the way his presence seemed to violate everything my restaurant represented. I walked to the door but didn't open it. Instead, I spoke through the glass loud enough for him to hear me over the sound of the rain. I told him we were closed, which was a lie because we were clearly open for the lunch service. I told him this wasn't the kind of place for children, which was another lie because we had a children's menu. I told him he needed to leave, that he couldn't stand there, that he was making our guests uncomfortable. The boy didn't argue. He didn't protest or beg or make a scene. He just looked at me with those eyes, those impossibly deep eyes that seemed to be weighing something, measuring something about me that I couldn't understand. And then he did something that still makes my hands shake when I remember it. He reached out and pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a muddy handprint there, and he whispered something I could barely hear through the door. He said, "I just wanted to give you this. It's important." But I didn't ask what it was. I didn't open the door to see what he was trying to deliver. I just shook my head and made a shooing motion with my hand, the same gesture I would use to scare away a stray dog. The boy stood there for maybe 10 more seconds, the rain plastering his hair to his head, water running down his face like tears, though I couldn't tell if he was actually crying because everything was so wet. Then he carefully placed the envelope he'd been holding on the ground in front of the door, weighted it down with a small rock so the wind wouldn't carry it away, and he turned and walked back into the rain. I watched him go, this small figure disappearing into the gray curtain of the storm, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no curiosity, no concern for where he was going or why he'd been there in the first place. I just felt relief that the situation had resolved itself without any real confrontation, without any scene that might have disturbed my lunch customers. I left the envelope there on the ground for almost an hour. I went back to my work, attended to my guests, supervised the kitchen, played the role of the successful restaurateur that I thought I was. It wasn't until the rain let up slightly, and I saw the envelope still sitting there, now thoroughly soaked, that I finally went outside to pick it up. I almost threw it away without opening it. I almost just tossed it in the trash because I assumed it was some kind of solicitation, maybe a school fundraiser or a religious pamphlet. But something made me hesitate. some small voice in the back of my mind that whispered I should at least look inside. So I opened it, standing there in the doorway of my restaurant, and I pulled out a piece of paper that had been partially protected by the envelope's plastic window. The paper was damp but still legible, and what I saw written there made my blood run cold. It was a check, a bank check made out to my restaurant for $25,000. $25,000. The memo line said, "Outstanding balance, final payment," and it was signed by a name I recognized immediately, James Morrison. James Morrison had been one of my regular customers 2 years ago, a kind man in his early 60s who came in every Friday night with his wife Margaret. They always sat at table 7 by the window, always ordered the salmon special, always left a generous tip and a warm smile. They told me stories about their family, showed me pictures of their grandchildren, treated my staff with respect and genuine appreciation, and then one day, James was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I remember the night he told me, how his hands shook as he cut into his salmon, how Margaret held his hand across the table with tears streaming down her face. The treatments were expensive, he explained, and they were going to have to cut back on a lot of things. He asked if I could extend him a line of credit, if he could continue coming to the restaurant because it was one of the few joys he had left, even if he couldn't pay immediately. And I said yes. Of course I said yes. How could I say no to a dying man who had been nothing but kind to me? Over the next 6 months, James and Margaret came in every Friday like clockwork, and I kept a running tab of what they owed. It grew to exactly $25,000, an astronomical amount for restaurant meals, but I never pressured them to pay. I never even mentioned it. James was fighting for his life, and if I could give him a place of normalcy and comfort during that fight, then that's what I would do. Then the Friday visit stopped. I assumed the worst, that James had passed away, and I wrote off the debt in my books. I considered it a loss I was willing to accept, a small price to pay for having known such a wonderful man. I never tried to collect, never contacted the family, never even thought about that money again. But apparently, James had thought about it. He had remembered that debt even as he was dying, even as he was saying goodbye to his family and preparing for the end, and he had made arrangements to pay it back in full. The check in my hands was dated 3 days ago, and attached to it was a handwritten note on a piece of Morrison family stationery. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone elderly or unwell, and it read, "Dear friend, James passed away 6 weeks ago, but before he died he made me promise to settle all his debts. He was a man of honor, and he didn't want to leave this world owing anyone anything. He spoke of you often, of your kindness during his darkest time, and he wanted to make sure you were paid back every penny. His grandson Thomas insisted on delivering this personally. He wanted to meet the man his grandfather spoke so highly of. He waited in the rain for over an hour, hoping you might have a moment to speak with him. Thank you for the gift of dignity you gave my husband in his final months. With deepest gratitude, Margaret Morrison." I read that note 3 times, and with each reading, the weight of what I had done began to settle over me like a physical thing, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Thomas. The dirty child's name was Thomas. He was James Morrison's grandson, and he had waited in the rain for over an hour, trying to deliver his grandfather's final payment, trying to meet the man who had shown his grandfather kindness, and I had turned him away without even opening the door. I had judged him by his appearance, dismissed him as a nuisance, treated him like he was something unpleasant to be scraped off my shoe. The rain on his face hadn't just been rain. Those had been tears mixing with the downpour. Tears of grief for a grandfather he'd recently lost. Tears of rejection from a man he'd been taught to respect. That muddy handprint on my glass door, I realized with growing horror, hadn't been random. It had been deliberate, a mark left behind by a child who wanted to make some kind of connection, who wanted to be seen as real, as human, as worthy of acknowledgement. And I had seen nothing but dirt. I stumbled back into my restaurant, clutching the check and the note, and I barely made it to the bathroom before I vomited. I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach, until I was dry heaving over the toilet, my body's physical rejection of the person I had revealed myself to be. Because in that moment, standing there in my upscale bathroom with its expensive fixtures and designer soap, I saw myself with brutal clarity. I saw a man who valued appearance over substance, who had built his entire life around superficial markers of success. who had learned to see people not as individuals with complex inner lives and stories, but as categories to be managed and controlled. The wealthy customers who could afford my prices were welcome, deserving of my attention and care. But a dirty child in torn clothes? He was nothing. He was invisible. He was a problem to be solved by making him go away. I had thought of myself as a good person because I had been kind to James Morrison, but the truth was so much uglier. I had been kind to James when he was well-dressed and well-spoken, when he fit the image of the kind of customer I wanted in my restaurant. I had extended him credit not out of pure compassion, but because he was one of my people, part of the exclusive club I had created. Would I have done the same for someone who looked like Thomas did that day? Would I have shown the same kindness to someone who appeared poor or homeless or dirty? The answer made me sick. The answer was probably no. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of running my restaurant while my mind was completely elsewhere. I kept seeing Thomas's face, those dark eyes looking at me through the glass, waiting for me to do the right thing, to be the person his grandfather had described. And I had failed that test so completely, so thoroughly, that I didn't know how I would ever make it right. That night after we closed, I sat in my empty restaurant and I cried. I cried for Thomas, for the rejection he had experienced at my hands. I cried for James Morrison, a good man whose dying wish had been to repay a debt and whose grandson had been turned away in the rain. I cried for Margaret, who had probably heard from Thomas about how I had treated him, whose image of the kind restaurateur who had helped her dying husband had been shattered. But mostly I cried for myself, for the ugliness I had discovered in my own heart. The next morning I tried to find Thomas. I called the number listed on the check, but it went to voicemail. I left a message apologizing, asking for a chance to speak with him, to explain and to somehow make amends. No one called back. I went to the address listed on the Morrison family stationery, a modest house in the suburbs, but no one answered when I knocked. I left a note, then another note the next day, and the day after that. I sent flowers with a card expressing my deepest apologies. I sent a letter explaining what had happened, how I had made a terrible mistake, how sorry I was. Silence. Complete and total silence. The Morrison family wanted nothing to do with me, and I couldn't blame them. Why would they? I had revealed myself to be exactly the kind of person James Morrison probably never imagined I was. A person who would judge and dismiss his beloved grandson based on nothing but appearances. The check sat in my office for a week. I couldn't bring myself to deposit it. It felt like blood money, payment for a debt I no longer deserved to have repaid. But it was also James Morrison's dying wish, and refusing it seemed like it would be dishonoring his memory in a different way. Finally, I deposited the check, but I didn't keep the money. I couldn't. Instead, I did what I should have done from the very beginning. I started researching children's charities in the Seattle area, organizations that helped kids living in poverty, kids who might show up places looking dirty and desperate because they had no other choice. I found a fantastic organization called Hope's Haven that provided meals, clothing, educational support, and safe spaces for homeless and at-risk youth. I donated the entire $25,000 in James Morrison's name, and I committed to donating a portion of my restaurant's profits every single month going forward. But money, I was learning, couldn't buy redemption. Money couldn't undo what I had done or change the kind of person I had been in that moment. The handprint on my glass door stayed there for 3 days before I realized my staff was deliberately leaving it there. When I asked why they hadn't cleaned it, my head server, a young woman named Sarah who had worked for me for 5 years, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. She said, "We thought you wanted it there," as a reminder. And she was right. I did want it there. I needed it there. So I told my staff to leave it, that muddy handprint that Thomas had left behind, and it stayed on my door for weeks. Customers asked about it, confused why such an upscale establishment would have a dirty handprint on its pristine glass entrance. I told them the truth. I told them about Thomas, about my failure, about the lesson I was still learning. Some customers were moved by the story. Others were uncomfortable with my honesty and stopped coming. I didn't care anymore. The handprint became a symbol, a physical manifestation of the way I had marked myself with my own ugliness. Every time I walked through that door, I saw it. Every time a customer entered or left, they saw it. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend it didn't exist. And that was exactly what I needed. Eventually, of course, The rain and wind and the simple passage of time wore the handprint away until it was no longer visible. But something strange happened. Even after it faded from the glass, I could still see it. I can still see it now, years later, as clearly as if it were freshly made. When I close my eyes, that muddy handprint is there, and behind it, Thomas's face, those dark eyes that saw right through me to the truth of who I was. Have you ever carried something like that with you? A moment of failure so profound that it changes the entire trajectory of your life? Because that's what happened to me. That rainy Tuesday afternoon became the dividing line between the person I was before and the person I would become after. But the story doesn't end there. God, I wish it ended there. I wish I could tell you that I learned my lesson, became a better person, and that was that. But life is more complicated than simple redemption arcs, and what I discovered in the months that followed made everything so much worse. About 2 months after the incident with Thomas, I was going through some old paperwork in my office, sorting out files to prepare for tax season. I came across a folder I'd labeled Morrison Account, and inside were all the receipts and notes from James and Margaret's visits during those final 6 months of his life. I hadn't looked at these documents since I'd written off the debt, and I started reading through them with a kind of nostalgic sadness, remembering the man who had been such a bright presence in my restaurant even as he was dying. But as I read through the notes I'd made, I noticed something I'd completely forgotten. On one of his last visits, James had mentioned his grandson Thomas to me. He'd shown me a picture of a bright-eyed boy with a huge smile, and he'd told me that Thomas had been having a hard time at school, getting bullied by other kids for his family's financial situation. James had been so worried about Thomas, worried about how the medical bills were affecting not just him and Margaret, but their children and grandchildren too. And I remembered now with horrifying clarity that James had asked me something specific. He had asked if, when everything was settled and paid back, I might spend a few minutes talking to Thomas about resilience and hard work, and not judging yourself by what others think. He had said that Thomas looked up to people like me, successful business owners who had built something from nothing, and that maybe I could offer the boy some encouragement. I had agreed. Of course I had agreed. I had told James that I would be honored to speak with his grandson, that I would be happy to offer whatever wisdom I could, and then I had completely forgotten about that promise. When Thomas showed up at my door, he hadn't just been delivering a check. He had been fulfilling his part of his grandfather's dying wishes, which apparently included not just settling the debt, but also giving Thomas the chance to meet me, to have that conversation James had requested. Thomas had probably been nervous about meeting me, probably worked up the courage to make that journey in the rain, probably been excited despite his grief to meet the person his grandfather had spoken so highly of, and I had sent him away without even opening the door. The betrayal wasn't just of Thomas, it was of James Morrison himself, a man who had trusted me enough to make me part of his final wishes for his grandson. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. I sat in my office with that folder in my hands, and I felt something break inside me. It wasn't a dramatic break, no loud crack or sudden collapse. It was more like something that had been holding me together just quietly dissolved, and suddenly I was falling apart in slow motion. I tried again to reach out to the Morrison family. I wrote a letter explaining that I had only just remembered James's request, that I understood now the full extent of what I had done. I begged for a chance to fulfill James's wish, even if it was years too late. I offered to meet Thomas anywhere, anytime, for however long he or his family would allow. I sent this letter to every address I had for the Morrison family. I even hired a private investigator to help me track them down to make sure the letters were being received. And finally, 3 months after that rainy Tuesday, I got a response. It came in the form of a brief email from Margaret Morrison. She wrote, "I appreciate your continued attempts to apologize, but Thomas has asked me to tell you that he doesn't want to meet with you or speak with you. What happened that day hurt him very deeply. He had been so excited to meet the man his grandfather admired, and instead he was treated like trash. He doesn't understand how someone his grandfather thought was good could be so cruel. I don't understand it either. Please stop contacting us. We have forgiven you because that's what James would want. But forgiveness doesn't mean we want you in our lives. I hope you've learned something from this experience. I hope you treat the next child who comes to your door with more kindness than you showed mine. Sincerely, Margaret Morrison." I read that email over and over, and each reading felt like a knife twisting in my chest. He was treated like trash. He doesn't understand how someone his grandfather admired could be so cruel. I don't understand it either. How could I explain to them what I didn't understand myself? How could I justify actions that had no justification? The truth was I couldn't. There was no explanation that would make sense, no reason that would excuse what I had done. I had simply failed completely and utterly to be a decent human being when it mattered most. I honored Margaret's request and stopped contacting them. But I didn't stop thinking about Thomas, about the balance he had tried to deliver, about the muddy handprint he'd left behind. That handprint became my ghost, my constant companion, the thing that haunted me in quiet moments and kept me awake at night. I started to change things in my restaurant. I removed the dress code that had excluded people who couldn't afford expensive clothes. I started a program where we prepared free meals for homeless shelters every day, using our best ingredients, treating it with the same care we gave our paying customers. I trained my staff on compassion and dignity, on seeing every person who walked through our door as a human being deserving of respect, regardless of how they looked or whether they could pay. I put a sign in our window. Everyone welcome. If you're hungry and can't pay, come in anyway. No questions asked. Some of my wealthy regulars stopped coming, offended by the new clientele we were attracting. My Michelin star dreams evaporated as we became known less for exclusivity and more for radical inclusivity. My profit margins shrank as I poured money into charitable programs and free meals. And I didn't care. I genuinely didn't care about any of it. Because I had learned something that Thomas had tried to teach me that rainy afternoon. That balance in life isn't about accounts receivable and accounts payable, profit and loss, success and failure. Real balance is about the weight of our actions against our values, the measurement of who we are against who we claim to be. And I had been catastrophically out of balance, so focused on the external markers of success that I had lost sight of the internal markers of humanity. 1 year after the incident, I did something I had never done before. I closed the restaurant for an entire day, gave my staff paid time off, and I went to where James Morrison was buried. I found his grave in a quiet cemetery, a simple headstone with his name, his dates, and an inscription, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather, a man of honor and kindness." I stood there in front of that headstone, and I talked to James. I apologized for failing him, for failing Thomas, for being so much less than the person he had believed me to be. I told him about the changes I was making, the work I was doing, the person I was trying to become. I told him that I would never forget what had happened, that I would carry it with me as both a burden and a gift, a terrible reminder of my capacity for cruelty and a powerful motivation to be better. And then I did something that felt both futile and necessary. I pressed my palm against his headstone, leaving my own handprint there, and I whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The handprint faded quickly, washed away by the next rain, but the gesture had mattered to me. It had been my way of trying to bridge the gap between what I had done and what I wished I had done, between who I was and who I wanted to be. As the years have passed, I've continued the work of trying to balance that scale that Thomas's visit had revealed to be so heavily tipped. I've met thousands of people through my restaurant's outreach programs. I've served meals to homeless veterans, to struggling single mothers, to children who reminded me painfully of Thomas on that rainy day. I've listened to their stories, looked into their eyes, seen them as fully human and deserving of dignity and care. And sometimes, late at night when the restaurant is closed and I'm alone with my thoughts, I imagine a different version of that Tuesday afternoon. In this version, when I see the dirty child through the glass door, I open it immediately. I invite him in, offer him a warm towel to dry off, bring him hot chocolate and something to eat. I sit with him and ask his name, learn about his grandfather, hear about his grief and his mission to deliver that final payment. I fulfill James Morrison's dying wish by spending time with Thomas, sharing whatever wisdom I can, offering the encouragement and support that James wanted him to have. In this version, Thomas leaves my restaurant with a smile instead of tears, with dignity intact, with his grandfather's faith in humanity confirmed rather than shattered. In this version, I am the person I should have been, the person James believed me to be. But that's not what happened. That's a fantasy, a revision of history that I don't get to claim. What actually happened is that I failed. I failed spectacularly, cruelly, in a way that hurt a grieving child and dishonored a good man's memory. And I have to live with that. I have to carry that weight every single day. The balance that haunts me isn't the monetary balance that Thomas tried to deliver. It's the moral balance, the cosmic scales that weigh our actions and our intentions, our words and our deeds. It's the recognition that we are constantly being judged, not by what we say we believe, but by how we treat the most vulnerable people who cross our paths. It's the understanding that every interaction is a test of our character, and we don't always pass. Thomas is probably a teenager now, maybe even a young adult. I wonder sometimes what kind of person he's become, whether that rainy afternoon left permanent scars, or whether he was resilient enough to move past it. I wonder if he thinks about me at all, or if I'm just a footnote in his life story, a brief moment of cruelty from a forgettable stranger. But I suspect, I fear, that maybe he remembers me the way I remember him, that maybe when he looks at successful people or enters upscale establishments, he sees my face looking back at him through glass, rejecting him before he even has a chance to speak, that maybe I taught him to see himself through the lens of my prejudice, to judge his own worth by the standards of people who valued appearance over substance. If I could say anything to Thomas now, if he ever somehow reads this or hears this story, I would say, you were right to press your handprint against that glass. You were right to leave your mark, to demand to be seen, to insist that you mattered. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about what makes a person valuable, about what deserves respect and attention, about what truly matters in this life. You were clean where it counted, in your heart and your intentions, in your love for your grandfather, and your determination to honor his wishes. I was the dirty one, soiled by prejudice and pride, and a poverty of spirit that no amount of success could disguise. Your grandfather was right to admire the person he thought I was. He was wrong about who I actually was at that time, but he gave me a gift by seeing that potential in me. And you gave me a gift too, though it was a painful one. You showed me the truth about myself, and while that truth was ugly, it was also necessary. It was the starting point for becoming someone better. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Margaret said you've already given it, but I don't feel forgiven. I don't feel like I've earned any kind of absolution. But I want you to know that you changed me, that you mattered, that the balance you brought that day tipped the scales of my entire life in a different direction. Every meal I serve to someone who can't pay, every door I open to someone others might turn away, every moment I choose to see the humanity in another person regardless of how they look or what they have, that's because of you. That's the legacy of that muddy handprint you left behind. So here's what I want everyone who's listening to this to understand. We are all being weighed and measured every single day by the choices we make and the way we treat other people. The balance we should be worried about isn't in our bank accounts or our credit scores or our profit margins. It's in the space between who we claim to be and who we actually are when nobody's watching, when it would be easy to turn someone away, when showing kindness requires effort or discomfort, or setting aside our prejudices. That dirty child I dismissed, Thomas Morrison, came to my door carrying more than just a check. He was carrying his grandfather's love, his family's dignity, his own courage and determination. He was carrying a test, an opportunity for me to be the person I thought I was. And I failed that test. I failed it so completely that the memory of it haunts me years later. That muddy handprint still visible on the glass of my conscience even though it faded from my door long ago. But here's the thing about failures, about the moments that haunt us and the mistakes that shape us. They don't have to be the end of the story. They can be the beginning of a different story, one where we learn and grow and become something better than what we were. I'm not telling you this story because I want sympathy or because I think I've somehow redeemed myself. I'm telling you this story because I want you to think about your own door, your own glass, your own moment when someone dirty and desperate and deserving shows up asking for something you have the power to give or withhold. I'm telling you this story because maybe, just maybe, you can be better than I was. Maybe you can open the door instead of keeping it closed. Maybe you can see the person instead of just the appearance. Maybe you can be the kind of person who passes the test instead of failing it. Have you ever turned someone away who needed your help? Have you ever judged someone based on how they looked rather than who they were? Have you ever realized too late that you had the chance to be kind and chose cruelty instead? I want you to think about that. I want you to really sit with that question and be honest with yourself about the answer. And if you've made mistakes like I did, if you've got your own muddy handprint haunting you, then I want you to know that it's not too late to change. It's not too late to be better, but you have to start now, today, with the very next person who crosses your path. Don't wait until you've hurt someone so badly that the memory keeps you awake at night. Don't wait until you've betrayed someone's trust or broken a promise or sent a grieving child away in the rain. Start now with choosing kindness, with seeing people as they truly are, with opening doors instead of closing them. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the way you treat other people, if it reminded you of your own Thomas Morrison moment or inspired you to make sure you never have one, then please leave a comment below. Tell me about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a time when you wish you had been kinder. Share your own experiences with judgment and compassion, with the balance between who we are and who we want to be. Understanding this story, really understanding it, isn't about feeling sorry for me or even about condemning me for what I did. It's about recognizing that we all have the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, that we're all one moment away from either passing or failing the tests that life puts in front of us. It's about committing to do better, to be better, to see better. If this story moved you, if you felt something real while listening to it, please hit that like button. Let me know that this message reached you, that this confession mattered, that sharing my greatest shame might serve some purpose in making the world a little bit kinder. And please subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories like this. Stories that look honestly at the moments that change us, that challenge us, that reveal who we really are beneath the masks we wear. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might make you think differently about yourself and the world around you. These stories matter. Your stories matter. The way we treat each other matters. And sometimes, a muddy handprint on a glass door matters more than anything else, because it's a reminder that we're all leaving marks on each other, all the time, whether we mean to or not. The question is, what kind of marks are you leaving? What kind of person are you when someone dirty and desperate shows up at your door? I know what kind of person I was that rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I know what kind of person I'm trying to become every single day in the shadow of that muddy handprint that still haunts me, still challenges me, still asks me to be better than I was. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my failure and I hope understanding its lesson. Now go out there and be the person who opens the door. Be the person who sees the human being behind the dirt and the tears and the desperation. Be better than I was. The world needs more open doors and fewer muddy handprints left behind by children who just wanted to be seen.